This video is a very brief introduction to the area of international relations. So first of all, let's start with the main tendency that is currently happening, and of course, from the name of the course, you may guess what it is about. It's about the globalization. So the main tendency today on the world scale is, of course, the globalization. So this also affects the international relations. So that's why we talk about the traditional perspective and we talk about the emergent trends in global politics. If we look at the human organization from the traditional perspective, they talk about the national societies or the nation states. In such a system, there are countries, and each one of those countries they act independently. So we organize into some kind of national societies. Meanwhile, the emergent tendency is to talk about the global community, about the globalization, about like for example, think global by local, when we also promote the local community and see the problems and see the interaction from the global perspective. When we talk about the interests, the traditional perspective usually talks about the national interest or the self-interest. What is the beneficial um, for our society? What is the beneficial for our country? Or in other words, a classical example could be America first. America first means that the self-interest of the United States is going to be dominating all the other decisions. America is more important than any other country, and we are more important for ourselves. Meanwhile, the emerging tendency is to forget a little bit about what is the self-interest and to think about the global benefits, the mutual benefits for everyone, some kind of identity-based interest, not just the interest of the particular country in a given moment. Traditionally, the interaction between countries was seen as a competition. One country is selling, the other country is buying. One country is expanding, another country is losing territory. It's always a competition. I win, you lose. Meanwhile, the emerging tendency is to see it as a cooperation. I'm going to specialize in the production of one product, you are going to specialize in the production of a different product, and then we're going to some kind of cooperate between each other or through trade or through, I don't know, um, outsourcing, for example, economic activities, etc., etc. How do we see the pursuit of security? In the traditional perspective, each one protects himself. We have to self-protect each other. Meanwhile, in the new emergent tendency, it talks about the collective action. This becomes especially important during the Cold War. During the Cold War, many of the small countries they do not have their own army, and they rely on the hegemonic, on one of the superpowers to protect them. So these developed different forms of collective action, like, for example, the famous North Atlantic Treaty Organization or NATO, that is a military alliance that represents the collective action of different countries. Or, for example, the situation when Japan had surrendered its own army, but United States is going to promise its protection in case of external threat. How do they see the pursuit of prosperity? In a traditional perspective, each one plays on his own and each one is helping to himself. Meanwhile, the emerging tendency is that there is some kind of mutual effort. We recognize that we interdepend on each other, so we need to collaborate between each other. What's the ultimate authority? In traditional perspective, it's the state. The states are sovereign and they decide for themselves. The emergent tendency gives more importance towards international organizations, so they could be better making those decisions and they could act like a more objective or more neutral way. And finally, what is the conflict resolution? Well, in traditional perspective, the force, the power, it's the one that is going to solve at the end of the day, as Bismarck said, through blood and iron are going to be solved the most important problems of the day. Meanwhile, the emergent tendency is that some kind of legal system or agreements, could be trade agreements, could be legal agreements, should be more important than just the use of brutal force. So, talking about international relations, it's a relatively new discipline. Before, traditionally, we talked about diplomacy, and diplomacy was focusing on the interactions, well, traditionally between kings and queens, and through diplomats, or through courts, etc., etc. So this situation had changed through 19th to 20th century. We have the emergence of this system that we have today with the nation states, with lots of going to become republics, or at least the monarchies are going to get limited. So as a result, we have a new type of international reality. Now the international relation is going to focus on the relations between the states, or in other words, the relations between the world governments. In such a system today, there is no central authority. There is no state that is going to decide for the rest what they should do and what they should not do. So as a result, we say that the current situation in international relations, it's unregulated, it's anarchical. Each one is acting in his own interest the way he wants. So this creates a certain problem. Let's say that we are all interested in not polluting the atmosphere, but we are also interested individually that each country is going to develop its industries, and those industries are going to create pollution. So there is an obvious conflict between the collective interest to stop polluting and the individual interest to develop industry that are going to be polluting the atmosphere. So precisely this creates the collective goods problem. How to balance the interest of everyone and my own individual interest. Um, So sometimes this creates certain situations, like for example, free riding, when I know you have a team, everyone, let's say three students are participating and one did nothing, but he gets the same grade as the rest. And this is like the problem of the free riding. This same happens often in international, global situations when I know five countries are participating and one country is not, but it gets the benefits of the agreement signed by all the countries. So how could we solve the collective goods problem? Well, we have the core principles, and there are three: dominance, reciprocity, and identity. In case of dominance, it's quite logical. We are going to dominate. So we are going to, for example, let's say we have a student who is not participating in our team. So we are going to make an agreement between each other, and we are going to, I don't know, to enforce. We are going to tell the teacher so that he is going to enforce the order over the student who is not participating. So in case of dominance, there is certain order, there is certain stability. The system is predictable because you know that there is, I don't know, a teacher or some kind of authority that is going to um, enforce the necessary decision. But also in such a system, there is a resentment from the side that was, like for example, that was forced to do certain obligations. The second principle, reciprocity, means that I'm going to give to you and you're going to give to me. Let's say that I'm going to do, I don't know, today's activity and you're going to do tomorrow's activity. So such a system has an incentive for cooperation. But it also can go downward spiral. For example, if I made my activity not so well, you're also going to make your activity not so well, and as a result, we are going to feel both demotivated. And sometimes it's difficult to say, well, which one is more important? The one that I'm doing or the one that you are doing? Which one should have more value, this one or that one? And finally, the last core principle of international cooperation and the solving of collective good problem is going to be the principle of identity. In this case, we ask the people to sacrifice his individual interests, acting as part of a group. Um, I don't know. You're going to argue that we possess the same characteristic. I don't know. It could be nationality. So you should prefer acting in favor of me because I have the same nationality as you than compared to a foreigner. I know when we talk, for example, that you should buy Mexican products because we are Mexicans. This is going to be the principle of identity. We are trying to force people to do certain behavior uh, based on the identity principle. And And of course, all this relates to a famous case, which is um, the case of prisoner's dilemma. Prisoner's dilemma is a classical example when the cooperation is logically beneficial for everyone. I mean, on if you look at it like in general, but at the same time, often each one of the individuals is going to follow um, his personal interest and not uh, and sacrifice the benefits from cooperation. And finally, concluding about international politics. So what it focuses on the conflict and cooperation between uh, governments and states. As a result, its most important subfields are going to be international security and international political economy. So the international political economy that is going to focus on the interaction between the economics and the politics, and the international security that is going to focus on conflicts, most importantly, the armed conflict. So these activities of the government, they usually include diplomacy, war, trade relations, creation of alliances, cultural cooperation, international organizations, etc., etc. And this course precisely talks about many of the current issues that international politics is addressing, like, for example, armed conflicts, like, for example, trade, economics, etc., etc.